good afternoon, participants. I hope all of you are in good health. Today, we are going to have the second lecture of International Week 2022. And this time, the lecture entitled Small and Medium Enterprise Post-COVID Resilience Strategy will be delivered by Dr. Vanessa Ratten. Dr. Vanessa Ratten is an associate professor in the Department of Management, Sport and Tourism in La Trobe University, Australia. She earned her Ph.D. in Entrepreneurship Strategy, Innovation, Marketing and Technology in UQ Business School, University of Queensland, Australia. She has published many articles in the field of entrepreneurship, among which are related to COVID-19 pandemic, such as COVID-19 and Public Policy and Entrepreneurship, Future Research Directions in Journal of Entrepreneurship and Public Policy in 2021. And in the same year, she also published an article entitled COVID-19 and Entrepreneurship Future Research Direction in Strategic Change. And then in 2020, she published an article in Coronavirus and International Business, an entrepreneurial ecosystem perspective in Thunderbird International Business Review. And then Coronavirus and Entrepreneurship, Changing Life and Work Landscape in Journal of Small Business and Entrepreneurship. She also has some papers under review about digital platforms and transformational entrepreneurship during the COVID-19 crisis in Information Systems Management Journal, and also Coronavirus and Social Value Co-Creation, which already accepted in the International Journal of Sociology and Social Policy. Please, Dr. Ratten, the time is yours.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to share the screen so I can show you the PowerPoint slides. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. So it's my pleasure to be here and to conduct this lecture on the small and medium enterprises post-COVID resilience strategy. So we've also got the chat box here. If you have any questions too, feel free to put them into the chat box while I talk about this topic. So in terms of this topic that I'm going to talk about, so we're looking at small and medium enterprises. So this is really important, particularly in terms of the global economy. Most businesses, have less than 500 employees. I'm just going to show you that. Sorry, it's going to go back there. So hopefully that screen is a bit better now. So most businesses, like 90% of all businesses are classified as small and medium enterprises. So it's really interesting, to think about as we come out of the COVID crisis, to think about what kind of resilience strategy that they're going to build. So the topic of my lecture is focusing on resilience. So we're going to have a look at how businesses can grow back stronger and better, but also thinking about some of the changes that they need to do in terms of their strategic planning. So particularly in terms of the COVID crisis, I'm just going to go down to the next slide. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, so I'm going to have a look at in terms of why the COVID-19 has created this need for businesses, to think about their resilience strategy, but also, some of the unique problems and opportunities that have arisen from the pandemic. So in terms of kind of the global economy, most countries around the world, have the same kind of problems and opportunities that have resulted from the pandemic. Some countries more than others, depending on, the effect of the COVID pandemic, but also in terms of, the opportunity. So it's really interesting, to think about entrepreneurship and innovation in terms of small business strategy, to think about what kind of new business markets, but also what kind of different products and services, these kind of enterprises need to be focusing on. I'll also talk about previous crises. So the COVID pandemic was a health crisis. So it was really, we haven't really seen something of this proportion, for a long time. So, they talk about the Spanish flu. I think that was the Spanish flu of 1911 being, the most similar type of previous crisis. But this crisis, was a health crisis, but also had a lot of economic and social effects. So I'll talk about, in terms of the type of crisis, in terms of small and medium enterprises, what kind of, strategies that they might do in terms of scenario planning. But also thinking about, how they can prepare, hopefully we won't have the same kind of, health crisis in the future. But if there are, similar kind of events, what can they do in terms of protecting their business, but also thinking innovatively and entrepreneurial, about how they can change, their business strategy. I'll also talk about, this role of digital technology. So, there's a lot of emphasis now on digitalization. With the COVID pandemic, it really accelerated this trend. So they predict that we really moved quickly, like 5 years in advance of, the normal pace, because of the COVID pandemic. So people working from home, people learning from home, this really created a lot of different, kind of impact in terms of these digital technologies. So it's really interesting to think about how businesses are doing this, but also kind of the related innovations. So, things like takeaway food, the use of robots and automation, there's been a lot of talk about this. In the hotel sector, thinking about things like buffet breakfasts. So perhaps, because of the digital technology, instead of having a normal buffet breakfast, that businesses might have vending machines. So people can, press buttons and then get their, breakfast from a vending machine using digital technology. So it's really interesting, to think about, what businesses are doing there. And as we move, through this stage, it's also important to think about what the new normal is. So it's interesting, we've come out of the pandemic, we're still being affected by the COVID pandemic in different ways. However, in terms of this new normal, what does it mean? So thinking about, with businesses, how much have they changed in terms of their business structure? Like, for example, because of the pandemic, a lot of food stores, moved to takeaway. So we've seen this increase in at-home kitchens, food restaurants not having normal standalone shops. And also in terms of takeaway services, they talk about, some of the bigger, food restaurants, taking out tables and chairs and just having complete takeaway. But so we have to think about this new normal. So it's really interesting, to think about what businesses are doing, but also thinking about the societal changes, that people expect. Then I'm going to talk about crisis management. So how small businesses, can manage this crisis. So, particularly in terms of the COVID crisis, like, 5-10 years ago, in my classes, when I was teaching, different kind of topics, the crisis would be like an economic or financial crisis. We really didn't think about, these kind of global health crisis that we had, with the COVID pandemic. And it happened very quickly too. So it was really kind of unpredictable. So it's interesting, for businesses, to think about what they need to do. In terms of kind of management, so issues around things like rent, leasing premises. In the past, it was normal for businesses, to have 5, 10-year leasing arrangements. Now, with the new normal, in terms of kind of crisis management, maybe they have to have different kind of strategies around that. And also part of the crisis management is really interesting, to think about things like supply chain issues. So different countries have been affected by supply chain issues in different ways. For example, with Australia, the supply chain, particularly with furniture, cars, which I'll talk about further, it was really affected. So, the price of secondhand goods really increased, because there wasn't, to get something from overseas, it took, much longer, than was normally the case. But also as part of this, in terms of the global supply chain, a lot of businesses, particularly like, phones, electronics, they have a different component being made in a different country. So if anything happened, with the supply chain, then they couldn't make the rest of their product. And this is really kind of evident, in the pandemic. It might be like a small computer chip, or it might be like a piece of, material in terms of plastics. But that has a really strong flow-on effect in terms of what businesses are doing. So we'll talk about this in terms of health crises, but also the opportunities for entrepreneurs. So it's really interesting, to think about, as we, come out of this COVID pandemic, what are entrepreneurs doing? What kind of business opportunities are there? So thinking about, the need, people, in terms of kind of social interaction, people like interacting with others, but on the same hand, because of the COVID pandemic, we've kind of been brought up with this, concepts of social distancing, sanitation, hygiene. So it's interesting, for entrepreneurs, to think about, what is happening. And part of this is, focusing on this resilience. So how to be strong, how to adapt, how to think about changes, and also bounce back, more quickly than in the past. So in terms of, this resilience, we'll also look at it from the perspective of entrepreneurial ecosystems. So building, this kind of culture, which is really interesting, in terms of looking at the different parts of society. So looking at businesses, but also thinking about government, individual citizens, families, the diaspora in other countries, how this also all interacts in terms of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then the last section of the lecture, we'll be talking about, how to kind of, what kind of, entrepreneurial ideas that you might have in terms of thinking about, what kind of opportunities there are. So in terms of this, I'm just going to go to the next slide. So in terms of the recommended reading, at the beginning of the lecture, some of these articles, were mentioned, but these are also some other references in terms of, some of the research, that I've been doing, and also, teaching this topic as well. So all these references are available on the internet. And the really good thing about, a lot of the COVID research is that it's freely available. So it's open access. And a lot of these, journals are normally like you have to have a subscription or go through a library system. However, for most of the COVID research, they made it all open access. So it's interesting too, to think about when we think about this post-COVID recovery strategy, to think about some of these changes, so in terms of open access, facilitating knowledge, and exchange, has been really important. So the first article, you can read these for more detail about what I'm going to talk about, in this lecture. But the first article talks about changing life and work conditions, in terms of how people's life has been affected, and also working conditions. So, some of the, topics that we'll talk about are, things like digital nomads. So different countries, just kind of focusing on digital nomads, people that can work anywhere. But at the same time, some businesses, particularly like, for example, with Tesla, they've mandated, people must be in the office, 2 or 3 days a week. Other businesses like Twitter are a bit more flexible and saying that you can work from anywhere. So it's interesting, to think about these changing life and work landscape and what it means, for small businesses too. So, particularly in terms of flexibility, hiring people, a lot of, businesses have had difficulties in obtaining, the right kind of people in terms of human capital, particularly with border closures. So in terms of that changing life work landscape, we'll talk about this. So that's a reference on that topic. The second one is about COVID-19 and entrepreneurship. So just generally, in terms of entrepreneurship, when we look at small businesses, entrepreneurship can happen in a number of different ways. So it can be through, like incremental innovation. So businesses, particularly small businesses, having to have like a digital platform, like a web page or an app on their phone. This might have happened prior to the COVID pandemic. However, there might be bigger expectations now in terms of their capabilities and services, available on these kind of platforms. So we can, think about it in terms of incremental, but also radical change, in terms of radical, innovation. So I think a really good example of this is like things like streaming, in terms of, television, Netflix, and related streaming services, that has really, been entrepreneurial. And the flow and effects of that to other business contexts are really interesting. The other articles look at in terms of entrepreneurship education and international business. So we'll be talking more about, this idea of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then, the last article, a reflection on COVID, different kind of comparative study between countries is also interesting. So, the kind of COVID pandemic started beginning of 2020, and now we're in 2022. However, we had, these different waves, and different lockdowns. So in terms of comparative study between countries, it's really interesting, for businesses, to also think about, what kind of different government policies there were and how this affected, their business operations. So, for example, some states in the United States, stayed open and they didn't have restrictions. However, in other countries, it was much more restrictive. So, the impact of that on small business is really kind of interesting. And the government policies, what worked, what didn't work. And also the trade-off effects, in terms of kind of different business, operations. So you can think about it in terms of countries, but you can also think about it in terms of different industry segments, for example, hospitality, tourism, but then in terms of sport, manufacturing, the technology industry. And the other kind of references here too, the first one is about the sport context, which is really interesting. So particularly in terms of these stay-at-home mandates, working from home mandates, people couldn't go to the gym, people couldn't play sport. So there was a lot of Zoom aerobics, sessions. But at the same time, to think about, the entrepreneurship, that has occurred. So some of this entrepreneurship we can see now immediately in terms of, increased usage of apps and other digital platforms. However, some of the other effects, we'll be seeing them in the next couple of years. So it's interesting, to think about, how, different kind of sport businesses, how they dealt with the crisis. And then the next two references, this one on digital platforms, talks about the Melbourne example. So if you want to kind of read more about it, they're all open access. But the second one about digital platforms and transformational entrepreneurship is looking at the Click for Vic digital platform. So in terms of Melbourne, where I am now in Australia, they say that we had the world's longest lockdown, so we had really long lockdowns, which also occurred in other parts of the world, but this was really kind of interesting in terms of the effects on business, but also the different kind of effects on regional development. So that article talks about in terms of the Click for Vic platform, because the Melbourne City area was locked off from the rest of Victoria, that people from the city couldn't go to the country, so that decreased the ability of farmers, in particularly to get their products, into the city. So these digital platforms, were set up by the government. So it's interesting, to think about how this affected business. And then the last reference is about, the challenges and opportunities. So it's a book that I edited about the COVID-19 impact on entrepreneurship by Routledge. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. Yeah. So just kind of an introduction, to this topic. So I think it's really interesting, and I think you're in really kind of interesting times in terms of thinking about these changes, the health pandemic, how it's affected the global economy. So at the moment, a lot of countries, we've got this inflation. So the interest rates are going up really quickly. In Australia, because I know the context a bit more, we had almost 0% interest rates. However, recently we've had 0.5% increases very quickly, and they're projecting that it's going to go up more. So we've just had this really big crisis, which was really traumatic, for, a lot of businesses and also people around the world. But we've also got this now inflation, also we've got, concerns, with Ukraine, in Europe, but the flow and effects, to the rest of the world. So it's affected the global economy, both developed and developing countries, urban and rural areas, but in different degrees. So if you look at some of the statistics, like the world odometer, if you look on the internet, on some of these statistics, it's really kind of sad about the impact, the death rates from the COVID disease. But also the flow-on effects, in terms of social relationships, divorce rates, family changes, it has a lot of social effects as well. But the COVID pandemic really kind of affected, most countries in the world, in the same way. So when we think about the small businesses, it's really kind of a global issue in terms of what has happened. So when we're looking at different kind of problems and opportunities, from the COVID pandemic, there's these issues around the psychological issues around, issues like loneliness, people were cut off from their friends and support networks. So that's really kind of different, to what we've had in the past in terms of these centuries of global processes and a network society. So before the pandemic, you just kind of hop on a flight, you go overseas, you really wouldn't think about it that much. Like, if you had the economic means, you could travel anywhere in the world. However, with the COVID pandemic, it just really suddenly stopped that, so like in Australia, I think it was in March, the borders were closed, in Australia, 2020. And then I think it was like late 2021 that they were then opened, and other countries around the world too are still kind of getting back to normal. For example, in Japan, you still can't go to Japan if you're a tourist. You have to go on a tour, be part of a tour, unless you're a Japanese citizen. So, there's still a lot of way to go in terms of coming back to the kind of normal business environment. And this is really different to the global processes that have been set up. So, prior to COVID-19, there's a continual reduction in borders. People, there was a talk about being a global citizen. So you were a global citizen. However, you'd be a citizen of a specific country as well. But there was this talk about, networks, people living in, multiple countries, people being transnational entrepreneurs, so living, between countries, but also diaspora entrepreneurs. So, for example, in the United States, you might have a Spanish diaspora, in Vietnam, you might have the Chinese diaspora, in Melbourne, you might have, for example, the Indonesian diaspora. But these kind of networks, that are used to traveling and, living between countries, that really changed, with the pandemic. And also in terms of this issue about increased nationalism. So this is really interesting, with the COVID pandemic, because prior to this happening, businesses, were really increasingly going international. So, in terms of the supply chain, if it was like a box of matches, the wood might be come from Indonesia, the box, might be manufactured in Australia. The marketing might be done in the United States or Canada, but it was really a global enterprise, and it was assumed, in terms of just in time, that these kind of, raw ingredients and materials could be like on demand. However, with the border closures and increased restrictions in terms of global movement, there's been this issue about nationalism, so people are really kind of refocusing on the country, in terms of small businesses, that has advantages and disadvantages too. So in terms of increased nationalism, people might want to get made in a specific country, because that's where they're living, but also in terms of issues like food security, which has been a really big issue, in terms of countries being secure in terms of their food supply. So, particularly in terms of small businesses, this is a unique opportunity. So in terms of food, for example, in Australia, they have like price charts, and they're looking at the percentage increase of some, different kind of foods. So you can, think about things like lettuce. So Recently, we had a shortage in Australia of lettuce. So KFC replaced lettuce with cabbage in their burgers. And, the lettuce prices used to be like, maybe $2, now like $5 or $6. And, sometimes there isn't even supply there. So you can think about it, in terms of these, what businesses that small businesses are doing. So if they're entrepreneurial and innovative, in terms of where they're sourcing food from, but also kind of, how it's grown. So hydroponic food, greenhouses, but also kind of, like apartment, growing food from apartments or from people's home. So it's interesting, to think about, what small businesses are doing here, with regards to the food security. Another kind of interesting innovation that happened with the food was, in Australia, they had a increase in interest about seeds. So they had like seed banks, and people could get specific seeds, and then they grow their own food at home. So in terms of the prices increasing, but also people having the time, so kind of going back to nature, kind of enjoying, watching a seed grow, from a seedling to a tree, and then producing fruit and vegetables that you can actually eat. Other supply chain issues around, in terms of the prices of vegetables were around, products like capsicum, like green and red capsicum. So in terms of what businesses are doing there, but also, in terms of the suppliers, whether or not it's concentrated in a specific number of firms or if it's open market. So we've got this issue around food security, but also energy, so for a lot of, small businesses, a major, source of, concern is around like energy costs. So, the energy market, for example, in Australia, I think it was a spot market for gas or other electricity. The government stopped it because the prices were just going up too much. So in terms of businesses, their cost of production, in some cases has significantly increased. So they've got, the cost of inputs, but also the cost of actually manufacturing in terms of electricity, gas. So what this means in terms of opportunities, maybe there'll be a quicker move to natural energy sources, like solar power, wind power. And some countries, like for example, in Portugal, they've had, I think, like 3 or 4 days of just relying on, solar and natural energy and wind power. So it's interesting, to think about what businesses are doing there, but also with regards to, things like secondhand items. So, some countries, like for example in Sweden, they've got secondhand malls. So they've got secondhand shopping malls. So everything that you buy in the shopping mall is secondhand. So instead of going to a shopping mall and buying new stuff, everything's secondhand. So it's really interesting, in terms of small businesses, the different innovative, ways, to think about this. But also, with regards to secondhand items, you can also kind of think about, digital platforms like Etsy. So, there's been a big increase in artisan and craft markets and interests. So, like Etsy, lets different people make things, but then you can sell them on the Etsy platform. So it's like, different kind of craft products, artisan products. So it's been really, I think it's really interesting with small businesses, what they've been able to do, with the COVID pandemic. So Etsy, I think, gets a percentage of the price of each good sold, but, people can sell things like handmade greeting cards, like keychains, dolls, clothing, and that was a way, during the COVID pandemic for people to occupy themselves. So a lot of people have looked at this like re-emergence, reinvigoration of the craft industries, which are related to the artisan. Because people were at home more, so they could do knitting, sewing, they could make bags. And this has, resulted in a large increase in a lot of small business opportunities, and also people too who previously hadn't thought about, that kind of career, but the kind of, because of the pandemic and the amount of money that some people were making, through these online platforms, there's been a shift, towards that, artisan crafts, so it might be like food, artisan food, but it also might be like in terms of clothing and other garments. So, we've got a lot of interesting, unique problems, but also a lot of opportunities, coming from the COVID pandemic. So in terms of previous crises, no one really predicted, the COVID pandemic. It wasn't, really, I think everyone was really surprised, when it happened. And also the magnitude of it, so, for example, the quick closing of the international borders, or if they were left open, the closure of shops or restrictions in trading. So previous crises were all more kind of, focused on specific countries, and we're kind of managed in a different way. So we had like the Middle East respiratory syndrome, which was mostly concentrated around the Middle East countries. Bird flu, focused more on like Hong Kong, China, Ebola, more kind of Africa. So we had these different kind of health crises, but they were really kind of geographically based, and they weren't as global as a COVID crisis. So it's interesting, with the small businesses, how they adapted to that. So, for example, with the bird flu, because it happened, and Hong Kong, was mostly affected from the bird flu, that they're suggesting that a lot of small businesses in like Hong Kong were more ready to adapt and pivot when the COVID pandemic happened. So they were much more prepared. So, there's some suggestion like, because of the bird flu, Hong Kong government already had all the procedures, policies in place, and also small businesses had dealt with that kind of crisis before. So they dealt with the bird flu. So they knew, they already had protocols in place. So it might be the use of masks, or it might be other kind of measures. And then in terms of other previous crises, we've had these kind of environmental crises, but they're usually predictable in a way. So it might be like the rainy season, typhoons, landslides, but they're normally kind of, you can see them, and, you can see, okay, that's a typhoon. The small businesses can get the insurance, they can rebuild, so there's normally a time period, a specific time period associated with that environmental crisis. And normally, they happen continually. So, there's, there might be state emergency services in place, to deal with this. So the environmental crises are quite different to the health crisis that we had with the COVID pandemic. Likewise, with war, and political crises. So, it's normally, it's normally restricted to a specific geographic region. So it might be the Gulf War, or at the moment, the Ukraine and Russian crisis. So they're normally restricted to a certain geographic area, like the previous health crises were as well. And the other one, the other crises, were economic, so 2009, 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis, the GFC. So that really resulted from the change in the subprime mortgages in the US. And then it had flow-on effects. So, companies like Lehman Brothers and other kind of financial services, were really affected, and the stock market, went down dramatically, during that GFC time period. So you can think about, in terms of small businesses, they kind of expect, these kind of events. However, the COVID crisis was really kind of something different that they hadn't experienced before. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. So as part of the COVID, pandemic, and the crisis, there was increased reliance on digital technology. So, before 2020, not many people knew Zoom. Like, I had heard about Zoom, but I hadn't really used Zoom. And then, 2020, everyone's using Zoom. Now, some people are also using the Microsoft, the equivalent on Microsoft Teams, on which is similar, but Zoom, so this kind of face-to-face, interaction, and also on digital devices, so in terms of digital technology, people couldn't see each other, so they might have a FaceTime or a computer, call. So there was a major increased reliance on these kind of digital technologies, which is really kind of interesting. So we had increased physical and social distancing. So with the physical distancing, we saw an increase, with small businesses, selling different kind of masks. Some people had been used to wearing masks, so particularly like, Hong Kong, they wore face masks, because of the bird flu and, just generally, like, in other countries like Vietnam, we're kind of used to these wearing face masks as well, but other countries, weren't used to it. So, it resulted in this change. There's a big increase in terms of sales of face masks. And related to that, you could get creams for your face. And also cosmetic companies, they said there was a lot of increase in cosmetic companies, from the COVID pandemic. So people, they couldn't go to the hair salon, so they had to do their hair at home. So it might be things like hair dye, nail polish, it really kind of changed, the business structure. So there was a lot of how-to videos on YouTube, and that also created, some, the YouTube entrepreneurs and also Instagram influencers. So it's really interesting, to think about, how that affected the digital technology, and also, in terms of sport companies like gyms, having different ways, that they provided services, so people couldn't physically go into an aerobics class or play a game of football, so they might have had to do it in a different way. Also working from home, so this created a lot of opportunities, but also challenges, for small businesses. So some small businesses had already had a set up website. However, during the COVID pandemic, there was much more emphasis on, this digital technology in terms of, seeing in real time, what people are selling, getting real time updates. So, as I talked about before, websites like Etsy in terms of craft and artisans, and, other, similar kind of websites, that sell those kind of products. And also, you've got Amazon, marketplace, really kind of increased, I think their overall shares rose, quite significantly during the COVID pandemic. But also, you've got like this touchless, so like it might be like ordering food, it gets dropped at your door. But also you can then track, packages. So there's a lot more interactivity as a result of this, change in digital technology, as well as schooling from home. So depending on the location, this affected small businesses in different ways. So if children were at home or, other people working from home, it might have had some impact, particularly if people had small businesses in terms of managing both. So they had to look after their children, but at the same time look after their business. And also this schooling from home, in terms of small businesses, it does have other effects, so for example, in Melbourne, Australia, because we had a really long lockdown, the schools were closed for a significant time period. So they're saying that has then flow-on effects in terms of literacy rates, in terms of how children reading, so in terms of their future careers, as small business, but also the social interaction, so, not being able to interact with peers, might have then impacts in terms of learning rates. So we've got these increased digital literacy rates. So people are much more comfortable in terms of, talking online, doing Zoom sessions, buying things online. So that's really increased, for all age groups, so from young to old. But at the same time, there's these emotional and psychological problems. So particularly for small businesses, if they had any kind of interruptions because of the COVID pandemic, that would then have the emotional effects. So it might be an issue around cash flow, and the cash flow issue was really evident during the COVID pandemic. So for example, with small businesses that had to shut down and weren't open, so for example, in Melbourne City, the city, most of the shops in the city were shut down, and that had never happened before. People were used to going into the city, going into a retail store, browsing clothes, having a look at different products. But they couldn't do that. So those shops, were shut for like 4 or 5 months. And that had never happened, to small businesses. They were always used to being able to open, but then they had to stop. And for example, in Melbourne, we had, time periods of, 3 to 4 months in terms of the only shops being open were, supermarkets and food stores and other essential item food. So the other small business operators, particularly clothing, that rely on impulse sales, or that the emotional feel of when you go into a store, they couldn't do that. So then they had to try and replicate that in terms of an online environment, but sometimes that's quite hard to do. So an example of this is T2, which is a tea company in Melbourne, and it's called like T2, tea for two, but it's really kind of well known, and it's got tea in a box shape, and then T2 branding. But a lot of their businesses, a lot of their sales are from walking shoppers. So they walk into the shop, they smell the tea, it might smell strawberry or licorice or, different kind of teas. But they're relying on that tactile, that sensory experience, and some of that you can't get through, digital technology. So, for small businesses, in terms of, their sales, this created, a number of challenges and problems for them. So they're really kind of reliant. Their previous business model was based on, the store atmosphere, the packaging, the smell, tasting, and similar to wineries, like wine, similar like cheese and delis, delicatessens. So it's really, for small businesses, they couldn't do what they used to do. And also the psychological problems, for a lot of small business owners too, from the COVID pandemic. So for example, with the lockdown, you couldn't go to the hairdresser for, I think it was like, 4 or 5 months. So, you could cut your hair at home. However, those kind of small business owners are really kind of, a lot of them are really people focused, so, they then have like issues around depression, loneliness, there's a lot of psychological problems, that were associated, particularly for small businesses, from those lockdown periods. So there's not the same kind of, interaction. So they can't, those small businesses, they can't cut hair, or they might not be able to provide any other kind of, beauty services. So that creates issues in terms of what are they doing instead. So instead of, being able to go to work, operate a small business, they couldn't do that. So it has that psychological, but also that uncertainty. So particularly with the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of psychological, problems, that businesses had, particularly in terms of the uncertainty around, the time period of lockdowns. So you had extended lockdowns like 3 to 4 months, but then you had like shorter lockdowns like of 2 or 3 days. So this kind of up and down, was really kind of hard to predict, for small businesses. So they might have laws, particularly in terms of rent. But some of the small businesses, particularly in Melbourne City, the clothing stores, they stopped paying their rent. But then when the lockdown finishes, then their landlord would expect that rent to be repaid. So there's a lot of kind of issues, that small businesses, have to deal with. And also that kind of move to digital platforms. So, for example, with clothing stores, some people want to try on clothes. But then if they move to a digital platform, through a web portal, then there's a lot of kind of new learning and knowledge that needs to be acquired in terms of how they do their marketing, their customer sales, their security around, their customer management database. So it's really interesting, to think about, how this, the effects of small businesses and what they should do. So you've got a kind of like a conundrum for a lot of small businesses, because often they're relying on that face-to-face interaction, that personal interaction. But at the same time, they have to have, risk management strategies in terms of, if anything else happens, having a strategy in place. But also some people have gotten used to those digital platforms. So for example, it might be a hairdresser. You can book online, but you have to pay a certain deposit. So, whereas in the past you might call up or walk in. So it's really interesting, to think about, for small businesses, this reliance on online rather than physical communication. And you can also think about, the flow-on effects, that this has, for business communication. So particularly in terms of things like texting, emojis, they're saying that, the new, a lot of communication is like shorter than before. So, the different kind of ways of communicating, through marketing might be quite different, for small businesses. So just going to move on to the next slide. So we've got this new normal. So for small businesses, it's really interesting, to kind of question, what does the new normal look like? So the new normal, it seems like, we've had this increase in digitalization, but at the same time, businesses are kind of getting back to normal, in most cases, however, at the same time, there's a lot of kind of legacy, like legacy in terms of, people remembering what happened. So it's interesting, to think about what the new normal means. So for example, with these border closures, so are people still traveling in the same way? So they talk about, in terms of tourism industry for small businesses, people have got insurance, so if something happens with the COVID-19 that they can rebook and re-travel. At the same time, are people still worried about, the kind of products and services, that are provided? So particularly, some of the larger hotel chains like Hyatt, Marriott, Sheraton, they're talking a lot about the usage of robots and automation in services. So you might book in, through your phone and never see a real person. And that might be like a legacy, from the COVID pandemic, or like going to a restaurant and, ordering everything on your phone, not seeing a waiter or waitress. So it's interesting, to think about that new normal, but also, this kind of reduced ability to travel. So, the borders are opening up, people are traveling again. But this really had an impact on small businesses within the tourism and hospitality industries. So, in terms of the way that food was made and produced, for small businesses, perhaps there's more, different kind of preferences, that consumers have in terms of the way that things are packaged. So it might be in terms of, like safety certification. You see some food places having like a tick certification, or it might be having like single servings. There's a lot of kind of different innovations and entrepreneurial ideas, that can happen, particularly within the tourism and hospitality industries. But also in terms of the new normal, it's interesting, to think about music and sport events. So during the COVID pandemic, there is a good example about Keith Urban, the Australian country singer. You might have heard of him, but he had like a drive-in concert. So it was like a drive-in theatre, because there was social distancing and physical distancing restrictions. People could go in their cars and drive and then listen to his music, from their car. So, that was like an innovative thing. So with the new normal, maybe, small businesses can do the same kind of thing, or, likewise with sport events. It's interesting with the new normal too. We've seen this increase in digitalization. However, it's like, you can buy tickets for sport events, for music events on your phone online, and then you just show, the QR code on your phone. However, it's really interesting too at some sport events, notably, football within Australia, they've gone back to paper tickets. So, people still want to hold a paper ticket. Even though in the past, because of the COVID pandemic, people were told not to touch things, like, not to touch paper because you could, maybe catch the COVID virus from paper, and not to share pens. so there was kind of like that thought that in the new normal, that the digital technology would continue to be, the preferred mode of transaction. However, interestingly, the sport event's gone back to paper tickets, because people want to keep a paper ticket. And then when you go to the event and you come home, you can keep your paper ticket as like kind of a record of and a souvenir of that event. And likewise with things like books, with e-readers, electronic readers, the digital capabilities in terms of, iPads, there's all these capabilities, Google Books, everything's digitalized, however, at the same time, book sales of hard books, like paper books, have actually increased, so we're seeing like, this new normal. Not necessarily is everything digital. It's usually like a combination. There's that option. You can have a digital format. However, in some cases, people still like that paper structure. So it's interesting, to think about, products like books. Everybody thought that books, would decrease, but they've actually increased. And also interesting, related to that, are issues around privacy and security. So there's some, interesting debates, with small businesses, how everything's kind of online, digital, going into the cloud. However, there, was some talk about people going back and using typewriters, so a typewriter, nobody can see, like a typewriter is completely separate. It's not plugged into any electrical device. So you can go on your typewriter and write a letter, and you can be pretty certain that nobody could, bug into, like go into the online system and compromise the security. So it's really interesting, to think about this new normal, but also to think about, the kind of, balancing act, that people want around privacy, security, flexibility, around, different ways, that small businesses can provide their products and services. So just going to go to the next slide. Down. So in terms of small businesses, it's really important, to think about how they can manage the crisis. So, hopefully, we're moving forward, and hopefully we won't have this kind of health pandemic that we've had in the last couple of years again. However, if it does happen, what do businesses do? So, normally, a lot of businesses focus on natural disasters, so things like flooding, a natural disaster like an earthquake, that they can insure for, or financial events. So, things like locking in your interest rate, so setting at a specific rate for a 5, 10-year, 20-year time period. However, now with this kind of uncertainty, businesses need to kind of balance and think about, what they should do. So things like interest rates, are interesting in terms of whether or not a business, should negotiate a new interest rate, or they should have a set interest rate. So they need to kind of think about in terms of the crisis management, in terms of, their financial situation. And also in terms of crisis management, not much has been focused on in terms of health crises. So within different types of businesses, it might have been looked at in different ways. So, for example, in family businesses, they often look at succession issues. So, if the founder or leader of a family business has a health crisis, then who takes over? But if you've got a health crisis that affects numerous people within a business structure, how do you deal with that? So, this is a particular issue, in terms of, businesses that need people on a day-to-day basis. So if somebody doesn't come in and operate the machinery, then the rest of the production cycle is affected. So the COVID pandemic really affected small businesses in this way. So in terms of one business might need a particular part, it might be like a screw or a particular type of plastic that then goes into producing a new product. However, if people in the initial business are sick and they're delayed by 3 or 4 days, then it might delay the next stage of the production process. So thinking about, in terms of, what businesses can do. So whether or not they need to have more on hand, raw materials, or whether or not they have to, think about how to make things in a different way, or change the hours of their operations. So like instead of going from 9 to 5 p.m., they might go, have different time periods. So like go from 4 a.m. to, midday, and midday to 9 p.m. So there might be like different ways to manage that. And you can also think about, the economic and behavioral perspective around, this crisis management. So the economics, so in terms of businesses, that relied, particularly, for example, with the tourism industry, in Australia, we had borders in the city closed, so you can go to the country, and then the state borders are closed. And the effects of it for the tourism industry, like they never had this kind of situation before, like just like no tourists. So prior to the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of talk about over tourism, so there was too much tourism, and then suddenly we had no tourism, so that was really a major change, in terms of people's behavior. So prior to the COVID pandemic, particularly the tourist operators were looking at, they could predict, normally on a, month or yearly basis, how many people were coming in terms of tourists. And then like in the past, you might have some kind of global event that was affecting a tourist region, but it wasn't like a global thing. It wasn't just like a sudden stop, no tourists come. So you can think about it in terms of this economic and behavioral perspective, but also thinking about it as a phenomenon that does not often occur, but has a high level of uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainty around crises, like 10 years ago, there was talk about, these kind of pandemics, but I think people kind of believed, that, nothing like the COVID pandemic would ever happen. So, in terms of kind of, thinking about the future, in terms of small business, it's interesting, in terms of those strategies, what they do, but also that sense of urgency, and also competitiveness, so some small businesses can pivot and move more quickly. So if they see an increase in online orders of a particular product, they can rapidly increase, their production if it's made like in-house. However, if they're waiting in terms of their production from another area or location, it might be harder for them to respond. So this is really interesting, when we think about, this crisis management, so in terms of some crises, they occur on a frequent basis and can be anticipated, things like earthquakes and bushfires. However, if it's like one after the other, so if you've got a, for example, in Australia 2020, January and February, we had bushfires, and then we went straight into the COVID pandemic, and other locations might have had the same kind of crises. But if you've got, so many different crises, then for small businesses, it's like, how do you respond? You've got this natural environmental crises like a bushfire, and they have experience and knowledge in terms of how to deal with that. And they've also got the institutional, the regulatory setup in terms of how, business does that. And there's, there can be help from government or, communities. However, if you've then got a health crisis on top of that, then it makes it much more difficult to manage. So these crises, you can think about them in terms of their difference in terms of their length. So if it's like a one-day crisis, or if it's like a month, a year ongoing crisis. And you can also think about it, in terms of the type of crisis. So is it like a political crisis with a business? Is it a reputational crisis? So did something happen with the products, that then led to bad publicity, and that has to be rectified. And then also the magnitude. So what did that mean, in terms of the magnitude? So it might be the brand name, the image. And an example of this was, the Facebook, people kind of with Facebook being more concerned about privacy because of, some of the way that data from Facebook was sold and being used in other contexts. So you can think about them in terms of being sporadic and being controlled. However, others are anticipated and the origin is unknown. So we need to kind of, think about it, from a small business perspective, what businesses can do. I'm going to go to the next slide. So with the COVID pandemic, we can think about it in terms of, being infrequent and unpredictable, but there was also, some talk about how businesses, you should be able to do a scenario plan. But normally the scenario planning, you look at 4 different situations. So maybe scenario 1, interest rates increase. Scenario 2, interest rates decrease. Scenario 3, interest rates stay the same. Scenario 4, interest rates go up and down. So you could think about it scenarios, particularly around economic crises like interest rates, or political crises, like a different political party comes into power and they might have a certain agenda, and another political power, but you can normally anticipate that change in terms of different scenarios. So a change in politics might be one political party is more focused on business or less focused on business and more on social policies. But you can normally evaluate and analyze that. However, with health crises, it's really kind of infrequent and unpredictable. So for small businesses, it's hard to know exactly what to do. And particularly with the COVID pandemic, it was transmitted via droplets. So interaction, it was never health crisis in the past. Normally, how people caught a different kind of disease or a health issue, it was harder to catch, but COVID was really infectious. So it was really difficult, in terms of, predicting that, but also, thinking about the way to do it. So you can think about it, the COVID pandemic, characterized as a black swan, so black swans are really unique, rare. So the COVID pandemic was like unexpected, but it had severe consequences. So it really kind of came out of, people were really surprised about it. So it had a great significance and major economic effect. And this is really important, in terms of thinking about, what opportunities, there are for entrepreneurs, particularly in terms of small business owners, managers, but also people working in larger, companies, in terms of, managing medium-sized enterprises, what kind of new products, so thinking about things like hand wash. So a lot of the kind of alcohol, beer companies, they could change to hand wash, to producing hand wash, because they already had the capabilities in terms of the bottles, the ingredients, to make hand wash. However, other companies, might not have had those machines or, the packaging to make hand wash. Other things like masks, so we saw, this kind of, we've got functional masks, but at the same time, there's a lot of kind of fashion with regards to face masks, so, a lot of different patterns, different kind of materials, so how people could do this. But also with entrepreneurs, whether or not it was tied in with a cause or a social issue. So, whether or not the masks were made, by different kind of people, or if they were made from non-profits, social enterprises. So it's interesting, to think about what entrepreneurs can do there, but also that cash flow change. So particularly for small businesses, they've got their, rent, their wages, their other expenditure in terms of, cleaning, insurance, so they normally, can predict that cash flow. However, if you've got some drop in consumers, or if you've got people quickly wanting other kind of additional services, it can make it really hard, for small businesses, and particularly with cash flow too. Some businesses, their valuation is based on cash flow rather than their profitability. So it's based on how much money is going through their stores. So it's interesting, to think about, entrepreneurs in terms of the fintech. So financial technology, particularly in terms of, Afterpay, and other related financial products, really became popular during the COVID pandemic. So with Afterpay, you normally pay in 4 installments. So you pay, a quarter of the price in 4 different installments. So you get a loan. Afterpay provides it, and then you can buy that particular product. So it's like the old-fashioned lay-by. So, back 20 years ago, and some businesses still do it, but you had lay-by, and you'd pay $10, you get a receipt, go back in when you had some more money, pay some more, and then you get the product at the end. So these kind of financial innovations, things like Afterpay, other, fintech, you might have, seen other ways that small businesses are doing it, are really kind of interesting. So these kind of new digital platforms, So we've got the like things like Airbnb, Amazon, but we've also got these financial technology platforms that people are engaging with. And also related to that is, new digital platforms around connectivity, but also providing like, smarter services. So, the governments in terms of, building these, starting up these digital platforms. So it's more interactivity between different people within a specific region. So you might look at like traffic flows, how long is it taking to get from one place to another, but at the same time costs, product, services, sales. So it's much more interactivity. And we've really seen this, as an opportunity, during the COVID pandemic, for this kind of interactivity in terms of real-time, technology. So a lot more emphasis now is being placed on real-time, technology in terms of what's actually happening now, and getting kind of real-time data. So this is helping, in terms of small business, but at the same time, in terms of market turbulence, there's still a lot of market turbulence. And also kind of really interesting, what's happening, for example, petrol prices have gone in, increased quite significantly. We've got food prices increasing now too. So, you've got this a lot of market turbulence as a result of the COVID pandemic. You've got inflation rates, and the uncertainty too, in terms of whether or not we'll have a similar kind of health pandemic or whether it's stopped. But then also the effects of the global economy, whether or not there'll be like, global recession, because of this kind of market turbulence and uncertainty. So, for most businesses in terms of risk management strategies, it's really important, to think about, what they can do, but also looking at their profitability as part of that risk management strategy. So looking at ways, that they can increase their bottom line, in terms of value creating, within their businesses. So they might add on, added services. So you could see that, particularly Indonesia is very innovative, in terms of these, added on, digital services. So, different kind of companies, their risk management strategy might be that they sell things online, but then they might be also a transportation company. They might offer, other additional services like removal, moving, so they can have a risk management strategy by broadening their platform, or they can just focus on, the products or services that they're getting the most value from. And also this kind of scenario planning, which is really kind of important. So thinking about different potentialities. So, thinking about different ways, the economy might head, and then having different strategies in place in terms of how to deal with these changes. So this is really important, particularly for entrepreneurs, but also thinking about this concept of resilience. So resilience is really about, how businesses can adapt and resist change. So with the COVID pandemic, a lot of businesses went out of business because, there wasn't the market there. They didn't have the systems in place to deal with the change. However, other businesses really adapted and changed really quickly. And this happened, with some, like, for example, coffee shops, they could immediately go to takeaway, and they limit their seating. They just go to takeaway, and they can do that relatively quickly. However, a clothing store, that might not have had a website, might just be like walk in, that might be a bit harder for them to change in terms of the new market conditions. So we need to kind of think about, this sense of innovativeness, so what companies can do in terms of their innovativeness. So how proactive are they? How risk-taking, how futuristic are they? So in terms of futuristic, thinking about potential changes, particular trends, what's happening. Like, so for example, it's really interesting with augmented reality, virtual reality, and also augmented reality. So a lot more people are using digital platforms. So that innovativeness, is now coming in. Like, for example, you might see a picture on Instagram and then you can click and go directly to that business's homepage and buy that particular product. Or you can get the ingredients and make a particular food. So there's like added on services. So with innovativeness, a business can think about in terms of how proactive they are about, looking at things like augmented reality, virtual reality, but also being able to pivot and conduct new activities. So you can think about things like takeaway coffee. Getting a takeaway coffee is really kind of common, now. However, 20 years ago, that kind of concept, wasn't, to get a coffee, you normally go into a coffee shop, you sit down, you have your coffee, but it completely changed. So these kind of societal trends, are really kind of important. And a good example of this, from a business perspective is Mick Cafe. So McDonald's, the first Mick Cafe was actually established in Melbourne. And that was part of the coffee culture. So people in Melbourne really liked coffee, and McDonald's saw a new opportunity to then offer, takeaway coffee through their Mick Cafe, and then it was globalized. And then you can see also, things like having an all-day breakfast menu, that's kind of like an innovative thing. So it can be, this concept of pivoting, you can do it in a number of different ways. So pivoting might be in terms of broadening the product line, so a food store like McDonald's offering breakfast menu, whereas in the past they just had lunch and dinner going 24 hours, so their takeaways are open 24 hours. And then also in terms of new activities, because people like this touchless, in terms of, not people not touching the product, so that they can then get their products, tap and go. So it's interesting, to think about, the ways, that businesses can be innovative, particularly in terms of how they're being resilient. So part of this is thinking about, how small businesses can use their entrepreneurial ecosystem. So this, concept you might have heard about before in terms of an ecosystem. So it's kind of like a forest, like a forest, a park. And when you go into a forest or a park, everything's growing in different ways and everything's interacting. So it's the same kind of concept, within a business setting. So sometimes they also refer to it as like a business ecosystem and innovation ecosystem. But an entrepreneurial ecosystem means, that it's being focusing on the future. So it's first conceptualized by Moore to describe the competitive marketplace in terms of predators and prey. So it was looking at, in terms of, some people like a forest or a greenery, you'll have like birds, you'll have different kind of animals, some, in terms of kind of the prey, predators, they might eat the greenery, whereas others, might be prey in terms of getting eaten by other animals. So it's a similar kind of concept, within a business setting. And this is really important, particularly from the COVID pandemic, particularly in terms of small businesses and medium-sized businesses acquiring other businesses, in terms of increasing their economies of scale. So by doing so, they might have that might be part of their risk management strategy. So if one store is going well, but another store isn't going well, they can then close one store and focus on, the other location. So it might be just like locational based. So this idea of an entrepreneurial ecosystem is to look at, what's going well, what's not going well. So what's growing, what's withering and dying, and then changing it on like a constant and fluid basis. So everything is like changing, emerging. So it's an ecosystem, like a forest kind of ecosystem. And this is like, describes the process of business, particularly from the COVID pandemic. So it can help, not having all your eggs in one basket, similar kind of concept to this entrepreneurial ecosystem. You've got eggs in different areas, so if one egg breaks, it doesn't affect the other eggs. So in terms of business, strategy, particularly from the post-COVID resilience, businesses might kind of utilize this kind of ecosystem, in terms of thinking about their position in the marketplace, but also their interactivities, like a systematic approach. So one business, might affect other businesses in different ways, depending on what they're making and producing. Other businesses might be more autonomous and not need the inputs or raw materials because they might be service-based. So this is really interesting, when we think about, how, businesses can deal with, post-COVID pandemic, but also in terms of kind of thinking about an entrepreneurial idea. So for the last, part of this lecture, I just want you to think about, how the world has changed post-COVID-19. And maybe if some people can, give us some ideas and we can have a discussion about a new product or service idea that can cater to new market and societal conditions, and share your idea with us. So it'd be good if, you can, some people can think about an idea and also kind of keep an open mind, so, in terms of, the innovativeness, we should really be broad with our, perspective in terms of possibilities. So an example of this is mobile phone apps, in terms of, when they were developed. So I just see, so just before I read this comment, so I just want to kind of open it up to everybody and invite if anybody has an idea that they want to share with the class, about a new product or service idea, that you have that can cater to new market and societal conditions. So does anyone, so I'll just read the one from the chat, or maybe if you want to raise your hand in the chat box, if you have an idea. Yeah, so Bramanto, Yadi, can you tell us your idea?
Okay, so I'm going to read the one from my chat box.
Yeah, good, thanks. That's a
Okay.
good idea.
So we heard of online shopping and deliveries, but how about online street vendors? Street vendors industry is like being hit hard by the pandemic because people couldn't bother visiting one in times like this. But with online street vendor, they can come to you and cook the food directly. So you can guarantee the order is right and the food is fresh from the pan or oven. Street vendor carts usually came with pan or even oven, so the owner can cook it everywhere. As for more developed countries, maybe you can consider online food truck. So yeah, that's my idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. Thanks for sharing that with us, Bramanto. So I think it's a really good idea. So, with the COVID pandemic, kind of see people would buy like food kits, like same kind of, you buy all the ingredients and then make it at home, but that's kind of going a step further, getting someone to actually make the food. And that was also kind of an issue. You could also partner it with like Gojek or another company, that could make the same kind of product or service. I think that's an excellent idea. And also, as you said, like the online food truck, that was really innovative. And related to that, particularly with the COVID pandemic, there was an issue like, people used to go to markets, particularly, but they couldn't do that. And like school fetes and fairs too, they then went to an online platform. So I think that, flows in really well with, some of the developments that we had, but goes further in terms of looking at new markets. Nicholas Gusden.
When I think about it, maybe because in Indonesia we have things called pasar, which basically markets, but most of the time these markets can get very, very crowded, like in the mornings, like such.
Yeah.
And what I think about is, what if instead of us going to the markets, what if the products of the markets gets delivered to us? Because because it's COVID, you can't go to places where there's a lot of people. If these products, like let's say it's a subscription based per week or per month, like per week to try it, and these products go to your house, first of all, if many people use this service, you can cut on costs because you're doing it in bulk. And two, you can, it's because some people, let's say they're unfortunate and they get COVID, right? They can't leave the house. They can still get the fresh ingredients they need from the markets and still be in the comfort of their home.
Yeah.
So I think that's my idea.
I think that's a really good idea. And like kind of post COVID-19, people are kind of used to these kind of, products and service deliveries now too. So people kind of expect it, so it's interesting to, people, they might go back to markets, but at the same time, they're expecting these kind of innovations. So I think that's really a good idea. Thanks for sharing. Does anyone else have any ideas, about a new kind of product or service idea? It can be, like food, retail, it can be fintech. Afia?
Okay, I've got a suggestion.
Yeah.
On my side. we can see that during the pandemic, the level of online product returns, they were very, very high.
Yeah.
And it increased throughout the world. According to a study that was done by Statista that was released last week. Therefore, in my case, the idea which I'm thinking about is on how to ensure that there is quality assurance on the side of online e-commerce retailers, so that then the number of product returns will be reduced significantly. And therefore, this will entail coming up with a system which will ensure that the quality of products that are being delivered by the various service providers, they are of high quality standards. Therefore, it will entail coming up with a software that can manage this issue.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. And it also kind of relates, like, I think it's Zara, the clothing shop, they're charging for online returns now. So it's a really massive issue for a lot of businesses, particularly like small businesses too, that might not have the same kind of scale as larger businesses. So that online returns is a major issue. And also, things like, they talk about how you can have augmented reality in terms of trying on clothes at home. So not actually trying on the physical clothes, but have like a make-believe, like trying on the clothes. And it might be shoes too, because, we've got all these different sizes, but then different kind of brands and different companies, have their own kind of own sizes. So I think that's a great idea about the online returns. Thanks for sharing it. And there's somebody else that put up their hand, but I can't see it anymore.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Okay, so maybe Bramantyo, Nicholas, and John is talking about the product side, and maybe I'd like to give an idea on the service side.
Yep.
So maybe in my mind, my idea is about virtual exhibition. So maybe the artist of a certain, for example, a painting or a sculpture of some sort, they can produce a 3D model into a virtual art exhibition, and also the visitors or the customers can pay through this third-party online system, and then they can enjoy the products of their painting and also arts in their home. So I think it's a great visible idea, because in this case, because of the COVID-19, the restriction of going to a museum is restricted. Therefore, there are less customers and less visitors enjoy to the museum. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. So I think that's a really nice interactivity, and also kind of, consumers are expecting, that kind of innovation in terms of how things are products sold. So I think that's really interesting, with the arts, and the culture, how that is being done. And also, like the artists and crafts, and the arts, like paintings and things like that, are really big business. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Someone just raised their hand. It came up really quickly. Was it Umara Arthi?
Yes.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Excuse me.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so my idea is it's actually pretty similar to Bramantya's idea. It's regarding like food and beverage products and also other like important products. I was thinking about like supermarket or mini markets. Instead of people going to the place, obviously it's gonna be more efficient when people can order the products and then go there just to pick up. So my idea is to make like an application where there are several mini market or supermarkets, and then people can choose the product that they want to buy, and then at the end of the day they can use e-wallet to pay the product, and then to pick up the product, the customer can choose whether the product to be delivered to them, or they can go to the place, to the store. It's sort of like a drive-through mechanism. So they just go there and then pick up the product that they have previously buy from the application. I think that's gonna be efficient rather than going there and choosing. Or I think I also know some mini markets in Indonesia have implemented drive-through, but that's I think not gonna be as efficient because they still have to wait in the line in the drive-through line and like choose the product. But with this application, they can just go there and pick up, and thus there will not be too long lines or whatever.
Yeah, I
think
think
that's
that's a
my
great
idea.
idea. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And this is like a really big issue with the COVID, as you said, like, in terms of long lines. But having that flexibility, I think that's a really good idea. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that with us. Another comment from John Zhang, I just saw it on the chat box, is talking about having a group buying behavior in a neighborhood, like people living in the same building to order the food from the same restaurant at the same time. That's a really good idea too, because people might be doing the same thing, but in terms of money, that saves, money. Sophie Chen. Sophie, you raised your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
If digitalization represents the future, does COVID-19 really change the direction? I mean, I just feel like COVID-19 has pushed forward the process of digitalization by 5 to 10 years, but nothing else is actually changed. With the AI technology being dramatically increased, one day we will all shop inside our house. We just put on the pair of glasses, and we have actually have the experience. So I don't feel like COVID-19 has really changed anything, except for making everything happen earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's really good feedback you provided. Thanks for making those comments. I think that's really interesting. And also related to that is, they also say that from a crisis, sometimes the innovation rate can increase. So it's interesting that you said, like, nothing's really changed that much, because sometimes I think, there's some research that suggests in times of crisis, people, that sense of urgency brings about a lot of innovation, because people are at home. And, there was some talk about, with the COVID pandemic, people, in terms of the mindfulness, people had to stop. People were used to going out, socializing, but with the COVID pandemic, you had to kind of stop, refresh. So I think that's really interesting, that effect, whether or not it has on innovation. Hanif, Rafa, Nico.
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Just so, as you've mentioned, because of the pandemic, there are so many fitness centers that are closed, and it makes it hard for people to exercise, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that maybe creating a gym truck, which is similar to food truck, but instead of providing food, they can provide gym services.
Yeah.
Would be very helpful for all of the gym goers out there, especially since we know that the gym equipments are very expensive. So maybe knowing that they are one call away from having a good workout will be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So same kind of model as like a food truck, but having an exercise truck. I think that's a really good idea, because like you could also look at small businesses like fitness centers and gyms. They had, before the COVID pandemic, they changed to like 24 hours. A lot of them, like you go there 24 hours, but then with the COVID pandemic, a lot of them closed for a long time period. But they also had the issues about cleanliness. They had to wipe down the equipment, but at the same time people were used to using that same kind of gym equipment, and that can be quite a big industry. And also the related like digital apps related to that. There's an Australian entrepreneur, Kayla Itzneys, and she just sold her company for, I think it was like 200 or 300 million. But it was like an app. It was a bikini body diet app, and that got really popular during the COVID pandemic. So I think that fitness truck idea is a really good one, because that people need to think about things in a different way. Jovan Permana.
Yes, ma'am. If I may, I want to share an idea, ma'am. So I think one of the biggest something that changed in our world in this COVID-19 pandemic is basically like we are doing right now, which is a social interaction, ma'am. So
Yeah.
basically we could interact in other parts of the world and something. And one of the main important things in the macroeconomic indicator is basically the unemployment rate, ma'am. So I think some of the product they can be done. I think already some company already doing this by, for example, using their employee from other country. I forgot the name, but it's called using employee, but the company is based from US, but their employees is basic employer is basically from other countries. So I think one of the most important product to innovate today is to make something that could fill the gap between country and countries. So a company from other country could hire other people using from other country like that, ma'am. So I think it is something that maybe some company is already done, but it's not really mainstream yet, man. I think it's already important to do that, and it is important to have a regulation. I think it haven't have any regulation on it. For example, it could be a company based on the USA have a employee from, for example, in developing country in India. We don't exactly know how much is their salary. I think it is important to have a product like that. I know it have advantage and disadvantage, so I think that is why company will do that. So I think a new regulation about that should be improved by the government. I think that's my idea, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think that's a really important, a great idea. And you can also see, like, a lot of countries like Australia, Indonesia, Canada, a lot of the different countries have got these agreements now. So I think it's much more. I think it's much more easier for them to have those kind of employment, practices. When that's really kind of encouraged. So they might not have to have the same kind of visa. It might just be a country to country basis, in terms of that human capital mobility. And related to that is really interesting. Like in Australia, we've got a worker shortage at the moment. So some cafes are paying, like they say that they'll pay for airfares, accommodation for people to come and work in the cafes. So it's definitely an issue, in terms of, human capital, like that, as you said, like that unemployment, but then other areas of the economy, needing people as well. So I think that's a really good idea. So thanks everybody for your suggestions. I think that was really interesting, to think about, what will happen. So I'm just going to conclude the session. So thank you very much for being part of just sort of like another. So John Merrick Ango said that's been there for with a social platform called Second Life. I don't know that one. Like, John, are you there? Can you explain like that platform?
Okay, Nini, I was answering someone called Bima with the Adana. Nini, there's a suggestion she had made that, Nini, and with my platform, I was giving her that such a platform already exists called Second Life. Second Life, and it's Nini, and I can say that Second Life, it is the genesis of Nini, of what Nini, of the metaverse that is being currently being provided by more industries at the moment. Therefore, it's not so much innovative.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for that feedback. That was helpful. And I also saw on the chat box, Adsra said that innovative education platform for mental health providers, so like counselling, peer support groups, and I think that's a really good suggestion. It's interesting with the health sector. Like I saw, during the COVID pandemic, there was some caravan providers that provide free caravans, so the health workers could sleep in the caravans free of charge, and they were just like parked really close, so they didn't then have to go and use transportation. They just went to caravans. So I think there's a lot of really interesting and innovative, ideas. So it'd be really interesting, to see what businesses are doing. So just in conclusion, so thank you very much, everybody, for being a really good audience, and pleasure to talk to you today. So thank you very much. And my email is v.ratten@latrobe.edu.au. So if you have any other kind of questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. So I'd like to thank you, everyone, and I wish you have a really good rest of the IWEEK. So I've seen the schedule and it looks really excellent. So I hope you've learned a lot today from our session, and I look forward to keeping in touch and hearing about how you go in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. So thanks everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rattern, for the valuable insights on small and medium enterprise post-COVID resilience strategy. Thank you again, Dr. Vanessa Ratten. We are so honored to have you here. Thanks for the interesting insights. And thank you, participants, for your attendance and activeness in the lecture. Don't forget that you have another lecture on 4 p.m. So see you later.